Back on Morning Line, our guest with us this morning is Professor John Weil from over at MTSU, and we're talking, as you see on the screen here, about what's happened at UVA and happening now across the country with regard to some of these monuments and the discussions of moving them and the resulting protests that come with it. And I'm sure there will be more that comes out today as this is a developing story. Let's go, lots of phone calls to Mike. Mike, good morning.
Good morning, Nick. How are you this morning?
Good, Mike. What's on your mind?
The professor talked about Reconstruction just a moment ago, and that's exactly where my question wanted to go. I had read that Lincoln had planned on the end of the war to have Reconstruction without occupation. Of course, he was assassinated, and then it basically turned into an occupation, and the carpetbaggers came down here, and the professor will tell you, the South suffered greatly from that period of Reconstruction and carpetbaggers. People got their property stolen, houses were taken, homes were taken, lives were destroyed, and a lot of these things came up during that period. In fact, the Klan was born during this period. And I just wanted to ask the professor if he thinks that if Lincoln had been able to bring the South back in under his plan without the occupation, that we would have these problems today.
Interesting. Okay. Thank you for your call.
There had been tension even before Lincoln was assassinated between him and what were known as the radical Republicans in Congress. There were some, and think about it, this was the costliest war in our history, not excluding the wars that would follow. And human beings being what they are, there were some who wanted to punish the South. On the other hand, the South many people in the South played into it, because they were not ready to elevate former slaves to the position of equality. And many of them particularly were opposed to voting. Today we sort of take it for granted that everybody can vote, but at that time it was like, well, how can you let people who have been uneducated, can't even read and write, why should they be voting? Now, the reason they were uneducated and couldn't read and write is that there had been laws preventing them from doing so. But, we need to remember that many of the African Americans had, of course, supported the Northern cause, and they were when the first governments were created after the Civil War, they were pretty much at the mercy of these former Confederate leaders who were holding them responsible for what had happened. So there was violence on both sides. I think Lincoln would have come to the defense of a defenseless people, but did he have our notions of equality? He did when it came to rights, but when it came to social equality, he did not. He progressed throughout his career, but he wasn't where we are today on this matter.
All right, let's go to Larry. Larry, good morning. Hi, Larry.
Good morning. How you doing?
Good. What's on your mind, Larry?
I was listening to one of your comments this morning, and I don't think our statue should be taken down, because that is part of our history, not only Tennessee history, but the whole United States history.
Well, there's no denying what he's saying. It is part of history. I guess you could maybe make the debate, and I don't think anyone's saying, forget all this, wipe it away. I guess maybe the question is, where should these monuments be? What's the proper place for them? Should they be in a museum as part of the historical telling? Certainly we teach it in our textbooks, and we should. But should it be there in a place of honor on a publicly funded state building? That's more the debate, because I don't think anyone says let's just forget about it, wipe it away.
We will always have, if you go to battlefields, you typically you'll see statues of leaders from both sides. It was part of our history. The question so often is, what is it that we think we're celebrating when we look at these monuments? And I think people read them in different ways. Some say, well, I'm celebrating the fact that I had ancestors who stood up for what they believed, and others say, well, they were the ancestors who were fighting against the freedom of my ancestors. So it's very complex.
Let's go next to Grady. Hello, Grady.
Good morning, Nick. Professor John there. Going to Greenfield Village in Dearborn, Michigan up there was slave quarters up there from the Hermitage. If we're going to tear down every monument, are we going to go tear down the Hermitage because he owned slaves, you know, and you know, are we making this right because we're showing the slave quarters in Dearborn, Michigan from the Hermitage? Now, hang up, listen to y'all's comment.
I do want to comment on that, and I wasn't familiar with this particular example, but my experience is actually very different. I just took a group of MTSU students over spring break to historic sites in Virginia and Washington, D.C., and the biggest difference that I noticed from the times that I had been there 20 and 30 years before was almost all of these places now have slave quarters on the property, and they've incorporated that into the narrative. And in fact, at Mr. Madison's house, you know, the father of the Constitution, for me, I had been there a number of times. This is the first time that I had seen that they actually had an unmarked graveyard of African Americans, and there were simply pieces of rock that were put out there, and they were actually reconstructing the slave quarters that were outside the main home there to remind us that, you know, these apostles of liberty sometimes were you know, they were caught in the contradictions of their own culture.
So it's telling the whole story, which I think is good. And the fact that it wasn't there in the past is they chose not to include
exactly.
that. So how is that different than, and I think I know the answer to this. It's context. It's historical context, as opposed to that statue of Robert E. Lee in a public location there in Charlottesville.
Well, I mean, to give you another example, there is now excavation at Monticello, which is Mr. Jefferson's house, of what they believe to be the quarters of Sally Hemings, but you know, with whom he's believed to have fathered several children. This was something that you didn't talk about 20 or 30 years ago. So you know, you know, people do need to know about slavery, you know, God forbid, but, you know, institutions like this could, I suppose, sometimes recur, and we need to understand, you know, why we found it prudent and wise and moral to get rid of it.
Let's go to Peter. Hi, Peter.
Hello, Nick.
Hey, good morning. What's on your mind?
I've got a comment on the group that tore down the statue in Durham, North Carolina. You know, I think it's important to remember that wasn't people that did that. That was the Workers' Party of America that organized that march, and they tore down that statue in an illegal manner. They committed a felony on camera. Now, I'm for prosecuting them to the full extent of the law, and I hope the Justice Department goes after them. But if that doesn't happen, the other side, how are you going to feel when they start tearing down Union monuments in the northern states? I've been all through the north, and they have every little town, Ohio, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, they have statues to the Union soldiers. Well, what if they start tearing them down or dynamiting them or defacing them? And then where are they going to stop? Are they going to march on Monticello and tear down the statues of Jefferson that are there? Because, you know, Jefferson was a slave owner. But I don't think it's going to be, they'll go after the Roosevelt Monument in Washington, D.C. This is a communist group. They don't represent democratic principles.
Well, I mean, listen, your point is good, and whatever side you're on in this debate, I mean, the rule of law needs to stand.
Absolutely.
And as we see here, the debate and the legislature will move and discuss what should be done with the Nathan Bedford Forrest bust, as I think what's going to happen is they continue to discuss it in Virginia. But yeah, tearing down what happened in Durham, he's right. I mean, no one has a right, I don't care what your cause is, to just show up in the middle of the night and tear down a statue on your own. And they should be prosecuted if they can find out who was responsible. Now, I'm not commenting on the group involved, but I don't care what the group was. You go and it's vandalism. It's property damage, and that's not the way you do it.
The biggest criticism of Lincoln was that he did not favor immediate emancipation. And the reason he didn't was he thought existing laws permitted it. He opposed the institution, but he didn't think you could just
You have to change the laws.
Exactly. And so I think, I think there is a valid point
So,
there.
Peter, and I think your point, I certainly hope, and I imagine most people recognize that those who go and vandalize and damage any of these, statues, wherever they may be, or monuments, should be held accountable and be charged with a crime if they're convicted, and then convicted if they did it. Let's go to Greg. Greg, good morning.
Hey, good morning, guys.
Hey, Greg.
Hey, we're kind of getting off topic. you know, the Confederate Army and the war and all that stuff. We could talk about that for days and days and days.
Yeah.
I think the whole objective of all this is to remove history as we know it. Hitler did the same thing, and that's what it is. It's like you go after these little things now, like the Confederate, and make people to become acceptable to removing statues and stuff. And history is. We have to have history because we learn from history. We learn what not to do. We learn what we shouldn't be doing. We learn from our mistakes. To remove history, you're never going to be able to learn from those mistakes because people won't know what those mistakes were. That's what's wrong with our education system, is they keep rewriting the history books to take God out of everything they possibly can.
Well, listen, I don't know if you was paying attention to what we were saying. There's a big difference between having something up there that's glorifying someone in the past that is associated with some real negative things, and what you just described on your tour that you took your students with, where clearly no one's talking about wiping away history. I'd be the last person for that. Slavery and everything there. But you said that they're now all of a sudden, as opposed to glossing over some of these locations, that they're showing that there were slave quarters there. And these founders of the country, by the way, they're great. They founded the country, they wrote the Declaration, but guess what? They also had slaves at the time. And, so you know, that's not happening. No one's whitewashing history. In fact, the problem is history had been whitewashed in the past. Some of my textbooks growing up were a joke, the way they painted certain things the way they were.
And actually, a lot of these statues that people are now questioning, they were not done during or immediately after the Civil War. They were done from the 1890s to the 1920s, when, you know, there were lynchings, there was, you know, almost no right to vote for African Americans, and when we had the beginning of the Jim Crow segregation system. So they weren't necessarily, you know, they often were sort of the elites of the day sort of thumbing their nose at, you know, well, we may have lost the Civil War, but we're back in power.
Yeah, right. So anyway, no one, Greg, is wanting, and you may think they are, but to whitewash and get rid of this so we forget. That's not it. In fact, I want to remember. Listen, we'll take a break. We come back, more of your phone calls right after this.
It stands